Well, good afternoon or good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's FAME webinar on updated HEERF guidance from May 11th that the department has put forward, and additional updates that Sally and FAME and myself have brought forward in discussions with Department of Ed officials. We welcome you to today's presentation. As always, we have the opportunity to record this presentation so that you can review it along with the PowerPoints at a later point in time. We also are going to try and field questions at the end of today's presentation. We will be on with you until 3:30 Eastern time, not 3, to provide ample time hopefully for questions. Sally and I have been able to talk to some department officials, and we do have some additional guidance on questions that we have anticipated that will work into the presentation as well. Use your dashboard on the right-hand side, normally is where it pops up for the gray area with questions, and we will be monitoring those and responding to them both throughout portions of the presentation and then certainly at the Q&A at the end. Today, as you can see, it's Sally and myself once again providing today's presentation, and it is the latest news on COVID-19 and specifically the HEERF funds under the Education Stabilization Funds. We'll be talking today about the closing out of your HEERF I grants, the requesting for an extension of your HEERF I grants, and potentially into the future, your HEERF II and/or HEERF III grants. We'll be spending a considerable amount of time on the department's new notices, including a brief overview of the HEERF I program under the CARISA Act, then the HEERF II amendments that were just provided by the department on May 11th, including the initial guidance for HEERF III, and the HEERF III FAQs, a document that we will be discussing in great detail because a lot of the questions and answers that were provided in this most recent document, some 27 pages and 53 questions, really touches on a lot of the information that blends from HEERF I to HEERF II and into HEERF III. And then we'll take questions. So without further ado, a quick recap of COVID-19 from the past and how we all got here with the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act, and the HEERF I funds that were literally now over a year ago, almost a year and 2 months ago, and the fact that right now, at the fact that we are a year and 2 months in, most institutions received their HEERF I allocations way back about a year ago this time. And as a result of that, you had 1 year to expend for all institutions, both your institutional and your student funds. You'll recall that when all of this was new to everybody, that we learned that the process that the Congress had put forward was going to provide 2 equal disbursements of aid, one to go specifically to the students, another to go specifically to the institutions, but both were related to the COVID pandemic and the ability to work towards making sure that both students and institutions had the ability to adapt to the delivery of education on the institutional side, and were provided additional assistance to support, hopefully, the maintenance and the continuation of students throughout the pandemic, as we were all challenged to convert from bricks and mortar face-to-face settings away from that to hybrid models of education or even fully online education. In those CARES Act HEERF I funds, one of the things that was made prominent was the fact that there would be a 1-year time frame from the receipt of your funds to provide and administer and expend all of those funds. You'll recall we went through the trials and tribulations of learning how to apply for these new funds under the Higher Education Program, or HEP, which was different than Title IV. We had to go through making sure that all of your information and your ECAR and your DUNS numbers were consistent with the information that the department had in GANS, a new G5 system that we had to learn all about and put forth the applications. Well, now we're at the back end phase of the HEERF I grants, and for most institutions, you're coming up on a time frame where you're deciding and determining, do I need to extend my period of time for HEERF I grants because I have additional money left over on the student or the institutional side? Many institutions waited for more guidance that has been forthcoming over the course of the last year and 2 months with regard to how to expend, in particular, the institutional funds, but also some more guidance and some changes that have come along the way on the student side as well. Nevertheless, regardless of where you are in the process, we wanted to make sure that you were aware of 2 things. One, if you're looking to close out your grants, here is the 6 step-by-step process that the department has outlined both in the FAQs and in additional information that they put forward on how an institution would close out your HEERF I funds. There's nobody would be closing out HEERF II or HEERF III at this point. Those are just beginning. But for your HEERF I funds, the first step that you would do is you would contact the individual on your GAN listed for your contact individual in box 3 on the GAN. You would ensure that you've liquidated all the funds and expenditures, and you would make sure that you have all the supporting documentation to go along with that information, and also provide assurances that you're in alignment with the recent changes to the uniform guidance. That's all good news that we'll talk about later in today's presentation. And you have a period of time to then liquidate any of the remaining funds that were available. You have to ensure that you can submit to the department all of your quarterly and annual reporting requirements. You'll recall that FAME has walked you through that process on many of our previous webinars, ensuring that you met the incremental quarterly requirements 10 days after the end of the quarter, showing on your website and providing back to HEERF information on the expenditures that you had within that quarter or that period of time, keeping in mind that your first reporting period was much broader than a quarter because it included all of the period from March of last year through to September, and then picked up from October for the subsequent quarters. You also had to fill out your 2020 annual report to the department and post that information as well. All of this is information that the department are going to look to ensure that they have and you have as documentation as you close out your HEERF grant. You'll submit all of the information to the department, and they'll make sure that it fits within their systems. The other things that you have to do are, as is often the case with Department of Education files, you need to maintain all of the documents, statistical records, and other information related to your administration of these programs for a period of 3 years after the date at which the submission of your last quarterly report and the closing down of your information. Last but not least, you submit all this information as described in question 38, which we'll talk about later in this presentation, to the HEERF grant auditing entities as provided for in the March 8th letter that all institutions should have received. If you don't have that March 8th letter, because many institutions have that in their files, but were not, they filed it away, but they didn't realize that one was going to become of such consequence, let us know. We have copies of that from a generic template form that we can remind you. Many institutions, however, want a little bit more time. So the other thing we wanted to remind you of is the fact that you do have the ability to seek an extension of that 1 year plus 90 days in order to ask for an additional extension by the department. And the department is being very liberal in the granting of additional time, especially for these first HEERF I funds. They realize that they, along with you, were developing a lot of these procedures and policies as we went along. Some individuals within the department, including Chris McCarron, who we've had on with FAME before and has been on other webinars and other presentations and is a major expert on the HEERF fund, said, look, basically we were building the plane as we were flying it. So a lot of this was new to the department. At the same time, it was new to us. Therefore, they recognize that additional guidance on how to use the institutional funds, the inclusion of individuals solely enrolled in distance education program as eligible students, which came after the initial act, and other changes that we'll talk about today, all relate to the fact that changes took place that might make it so you want to expend your funds over a little bit longer than a 1 year time horizon. In order to be able to request and gain that extension, you do have to work with the department and through the department to seek their actual approval. The process is not unlike anything else you've already done with these HEERF programs. You need to contact your program officer. Again, box 3 on your GAN's information gives you the name of that individual you're probably already familiar with and have had correspondence with that individual on multiple occasions, but you contact them. You provide the specific reasons as to why you're seeking an extension. Again, for many institutions, it's as simple as stating we held off on expenditure of portions of our funds, awaiting additional guidance from Congress and then from the Department of Education. Once we now have that information, we're completing the utilization of our expenditures under that compliance and under those retroactive new pieces of beneficial student as well as institutional guidance, and include a date and time of which you think that you're going to be able to complete that process. I will give you insights that many institutions have asked for between 60, 90, 120 days and have gotten that, and in some cases more. The department, again, does recognize and is being supportive of making sure that institutions have full opportunity across all sectors of higher education, across all different types of the awarding, whether that be for a private for-profit, a private nonprofit, or state colleges and universities, in order for them to fully expend their funds. One of the reasons that Sally and I talk about this being so important, and one of the areas where you might need your extension, is related to, once again, those student funds that you extended, meaning you attempted to give the money to students that for whatever reason didn't get received and therefore have not actually been fully expended. Let's say you had students that were part of various cohorts that you sent information out to and sent their eligible portions of the funds on the student side, and for whatever reason they either chose not to, or you weren't able to finally track that individual down, and you have portions of your student funds that remain unexpended, even though you endeavored and attempted under your policies and procedures to fully extend all of that money out. Well, if you haven't completed that entire process and those monies are still sitting there and you've technically used all of your institutional funds, you're out of compliance with the rules and the regulations that you signed off on with your agreement and certification documents at the start of this process. So you might be requesting additional time in order to clean that up, in order to make it so that you void out those checks. And we'll talk about specific guidance that the department has included on what that process looks like, the fact that you can do that, the fact that you can also use portions of your institutional money, if not already expended elsewhere, to do that process, but back that out, redistribute it, make sure that all of your funds are distributed on the student side as well as the institutional side for HEERF I, and then submit all of the information in the process that we did just before in order to show that you're going to be preparing to close out the process at a later date and time. For this particular area, we included the URL specifically on where this information is housed on the Department of Education's website so that you can garner it very quickly and very easily and review it and do your extension. Obviously, if you're coming up on your deadlines, you want to do this as soon as possible. You want to be able to show the department that you are preparing for and recognize that you're coming up on these deadlines and they will work with you on the ability to move forward.
So Tom, if you think that you can complete everything within that 90-day period, are you still required to do an extension, or you just go ahead and have that 90 days?
The department recommends that you go ahead and request the extension because, again, stuff happens. You'd be proud of me, Sally. Stuff happens, and the reality is they are, again, being very open-minded and very liberal in the ability to recognize that additional time may be necessary. I've had institutions that have requested periods of far less than a year that have gotten a full year. And those are institutions that are looking to participate and continue participating in the HEERF II and HEERF III programs. So the department knows that this is a continuation that will be ongoing. And they also, again, recognize that some of their guidance has thrust different decision-making on all types of institutions that warrant giving additional time, Sally, and our community for your expenditure of all of those first rounds of funds.
The other thing I wanted to bring up is I've had a few institutions ask me what happens if they just want to return funds and not use them. And basically, if you're dealing with FAME, you've drawn those funds down either into the Pell account or into the direct loan account, and then moved them over to another account at your institution. You would deposit those funds back into the Pell or direct loan account, whichever one you drew the GANS amount into. Tell FAME what the GANS number is so that we return it to the correct program, and that you want to return funds back. And so you would do that before you close everything out.
And in doing that, again, you have forms and specific things, and we'll talk just in a few minutes about other forms for HEERF II and HEERF III, but Sally's absolutely right. And as part of the process of closing it out, when you get the forms and you're putting this information together, along with all of the things that I alluded to earlier, you will be checking off certain boxes and explaining if you're giving back money. The good news is that, again, you still are bound by the 50-50 requirement. So pay very close attention as you're giving money back, because if you've given money or giving money back, even if it's not utilized, and you spent more on the institutional side than you did on the student side, you are out of compliance with the certification and agreement that you signed. So be careful and be cautious as you're looking at closing these books out, that if that is a circumstance you find yourself in, ask for the extension, spend the rest of the money for the students so that you don't put yourself in harm's way.
Good advice, Tom.
Now moving on to the department's new notices and new informations. Just a real quick reminder, we did see back earlier this year the introduction of the HEERF II websites, and the department put those forward not only back in January for the overall utilization of the HEERF II funds, but also a specific sub-site directed at proprietary institutions, because as you'll recall, with the HEERF II money, for the first time we saw a clear distinction and deviation between HEERF money going to what they continue to call the A1 institutions versus the A4 institutions. A1 institutions include private nonprofits, public institutions at the state level. A4 is just for the proprietary sector. And the reason that the department had to develop these separations is because Congress and the statute determined that while our students were worthy of additional funds to continue to fight the pandemic and issues that our students were having with coping with the pandemic, that it was determined that our institutions shouldn't receive any additional funds. Those of you within FAME that are private nonprofits or public institutions, you're under the A1 category and you received both institutional as well as student funds. Those of you who are A4, proprietary institutions, only received the funds that could be then continued to be administered to your students. There were specific requirements that go with each. Again, we'll remind you of some of those as we go through the FAQs and the other updated information. But as you can see here, the key differentiation at the start of HEERF II was the splitting of students in the proprietary sector, students and institutional aid for all other types of institutions. There were different restrictions on the drawdown of those funds. The proprietary schools had to submit entirely new applications, whereas institutions that were not Title IV did not. The funds were flowing through your prior application process and through your prior GAN system. There was and is new requirements for all institutions in terms of the development and prioritization of your student funds, and those are based on exceptional need. We've spent a lot of time in prior webinars, and we will again today, because the department did a very good job in helping clarify what exceptional need means, and therefore how all institutions, regardless of type, need to look at prioritizing their spend on the student side and the expenditures on the student side. So we'll talk about that in greater detail as well. We learned for the first time under HEERF II that non-Title IV students, as well as Title IV students, were eligible for the HEERF funds, as are individuals solely enrolled in online education programs. And as we've now come forward into HEERF III, as we'll talk about once again a little later, we now also have guidance as of May 11 that ensures that DACA, immigrants, and other groups of students that too were prohibited from access to the funds are now fully eligible as well. We'll get into the granularity of those as we go through some questions here in just a little bit. We also learned for the first time, especially for institutions and students within the proprietary community, that the student funds can be used to pay down tuition fees and other institutional charges at the institution, but only with the specific permission and agreement by the students. The students' money is to go to the students first. If the students choose to have that money then come back to you to pay off portions of tuition and fees, credit balances, or other things, that is a way in which the funds can be used, but there must be express consent by the students in order to do that. We'll talk again in greater detail on how that process would work and how it unfolds both at public and private nonprofits, as well as our proprietary institutions in the FAQ. Again, like with HEERF I, we're supposed to have 1 year in order to expend all of the HEERF II funds. We're starting off on a little bit of a slow footing under HEERF II, the same way we did under HEERF I. A number of institutions have received their allocations, whether it be the A1 institutions or the A4 proprietary institutions, and candidly haven't spent $1 of those funds yet, awaiting the type of information that we fortunately received just a little over 2 weeks ago. So what does that information look like, and how did we receive it? Well, we received it in 2 formats. One, a HEERF II amendment, a rather lengthy portion of 126 pages that was published in the Federal Register, and the department put forth additional guidance. We'll talk about all of that. And then also some initial guidance on HEERF III, the funds that came most recently through the American Rescue Plan. You'll recall we now have 3 basic types of funding, all going to students and, in some instances, institutions, to the tune of over $100 billion between the original CARES Act money, the CARISA money, which was the Coronavirus Relief and Stimulus Education, CRRSAA, and then most recently, the American Rescue Plan, Mr. Biden's first of his 3 Building Back Better proposals that Congress enacted earlier this year. Again, access to this various information. The initial guidance, similar to HEERF II, have websites that are specifically HEERF II and HEERF III, both from the broader umbrella of all institutions, and a secondary page that deals specifically with the proprietary institutions. Yet again, because of the distinction of no institutional funds going to our community, but going to the others, and some other limitations that are placed just on the proprietary sector. Here are some of the key elements of what the information says with regard to the new HEERF III guidance. And because the HEERF III guidance rolls back retroactively, like the HEERF II, this literally applies, if you can think of it, going back through the entire weaving of the thread back to HEERF I. And the main issues are, and the key highlights are that institutions that were previously received HEERF II funds are eligible for the HEERF III funds, and you don't have to go through the more extended process like you just did and completed by April 15th of applying with the full GANS process. You're going to be able to, if you applied for the HEERF II funds, to be able to do a much more abbreviated required proprietary institution certification. 5 pages, much more simplistic than the GANS process and the application process that you went through before in order to apply for your HEERF III funding. You have 90 days in which to do so. So the magical deadline, whereas before it was April 15th, now it's August 11th. And all institutions within the proprietary sector, as well as all institutions with nonprofit and public institutions, have until August 11th to initiate various actions. For the proprietary sector, if you are a participant in HEERF II, you need to acknowledge and fill out the RPIC form by that date. If you are a private nonprofit or state public institution or other, you have until August 11th to simply affirm the HEERF III funds that will drop into your GANS accounts, that you're accepting those. The department makes it very clear if you start to expend those funds, that is an acknowledgement of your acceptance of the HEERF III process. So August 11th becomes a key date for everybody. Some distinctions with a difference, once again, are for the proprietary sector, A4 institutions only. There is a portion of, or actually it does apply to all institutions. You do have a new section on your guidance with regard to any entity that has over a 25% ownership in an institution must certify and attest to the application process. So in addition to the owner or chief executive officer having to sign information under subsection 1, you then also have the request by the department that each individual owner of a proprietary institution with 25% more ownership have to fill out that information as well. And that then relates to the various owner documents and blocks that you have to fill in. One of your questions is going to be, Tom, why is the department seeking that information? The reality is we believe that it's a twofold answer. One is because they want to make sure that this information, which you've already publicly disclosed on your e-car and elsewhere, is up to date. And this is a way for them to capture the most recent up-to-date information from your institutions and review that in conjunction with your prior reporting. The second is, under the False Claims Act, and with a great deal of the discussions of the past 3 months with the new Democrats coming in the House and Senate, there are those individuals that believe that the department should, and has not in the past, use their capability of going after individuals in the event of school closings for personal financial liability. So in order to know that information, collect that information, and send yet another signal that that tool is, and already has been, in the arsenal for the Department of Education, they are asking for this additional documentation within our community. Private nonprofits are asked for the same information as well. Public institutions obviously are not. You are governed by your state, and it's the good faith and credit of the state that backs those institutions. So this is one of the distinctions with a difference that once again comes through with the new HEERF III guidance and the policies that go along with it. Interestingly enough, the department does acknowledge that now after HEERF I and HEERF II, that there are institutions, both within any of the communities, that may no longer choose to draw down additional funds. And there is a process that all institutions must once again go through if in fact you're going to choose to deny your funds. If you're a public institution or a private nonprofit, or if you're a proprietary institution, any of you must, on or before, once again, that magical date of August 11th, fill out this voluntary determination of not to accept either all or portions of your HEERF III funding. And what you do in this particular instance is, as you can hopefully see at the bottom here, depending on what type of institution you are, A1 or A4, you then check which type of institution you are, and based on that, you then say you're declining all of your proportions or some portion of your funds, and you share that information and have to submit that back to the department and specifically make that acknowledged as well. This is all in the way of making it so that the department can then reissue those funds that are not being utilized by institutions. And there is a fair question, as this continues to go forward, which institutions and whether or not some or all institutions will start to no longer draw down and utilize these funds. Some institutions across different sectors, whether it be public, private nonprofit, private for-profit, and others, believe that they have expended enough money for the students to truly and adequately have them help make their way through the pandemic, and that doing more is potentially problematic, and therefore may not want to provide these funds and may not need or want additional administrative or institutional funds on the private, nonprofit, or state side. For our proprietary community, even with the inability to have any institutional funds, after the HEERF II, on top of the HEERF I grants, there are some institutions that are legitimately questioning whether or not they want to draw down the HEERF III funds. Part of that could be administratively, because unfortunately our entities and our communities in the proprietary side are not given any support, fiscal support, in order to administer these programs, and therefore might not see the benefit or might be hard pressed to see the capability to maintain the delivery for the students, even though beneficial to the students under the current circumstances. So there is a great deal of discussion that is ongoing about whether or not institutions will draw down the HEERF III monies in addition to the HEERF II funds. Where we're going with this is the department acknowledges that as well, and there is now a process that yet again, all institutions by August 11th, have to determine and basically have to assert what decision and direction they're going to take with regard to all or a portion of their HEERF III funds on or before August 11th of this year. What is important to note here as well is that if you're thinking as an institution what direction you want to go, you want to obviously consult with your internal leadership team. You might want to also discuss this with your CPAs and your council. One of the questions that I know has come up, and one that we've already asked the department that there is nothing in writing and there is no answer for yet, is, okay, we've seen the CARES Act, we've seen CARISA, we've seen the American Rescue Plan. We know that there are 2 additional Biden plans out there, the American Jobs and the American Families Plan, that could bring even more money into higher education through these grant programs. If we opt out of 2, are we eligible? Opt out of 3, are we eligible for 4 and 5 or not? The department doesn't have an answer for that. A lot of it is contingent upon the way Congress would develop that corresponding legislation. So there are discussions going on with Capitol Hill as well as with the department on those very issues. The department in this instance does have to basically hedge, because a lot of that could be determined by Congress and stipulated in the next round of funding, if there even is a next round of funding. So nobody has the answer to that question. Again, if you do it partially, whether it be at a proprietary institution or at another institution, that leaves at least the door open potentially to answer that question because you were part of it. Again, there is also the questioning of, what if I'm an institution that didn't choose to participate in HEERF II, but want to participate in HEERF III? Under the current statute and current requirements, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, institutions have the ability to do that. So right now, the door is open, even for HEERF III, by August 11th, even if you didn't participate and complete the application and the drawdown process, regardless of type of institution, by the April 15th, 2021 deadline.
I think some of the problems are, I'm sorry,
go ahead,
Tom.
No, go ahead.
I think some of the problems our institutions are facing is the fact that now that coronavirus seems to be somewhat under control, and this has to be specifically related to coronavirus to give the students the money, schools are struggling with, what are they going to do with this money? That some of the students aren't going to need it under this particular requirement. They might need money because they're lower income students, etc., but it doesn't necessarily relate to things that arise from coronavirus, such as the tuition and food and housing and healthcare and stuff. That's strictly related to that.
Well, and at the same time, they have also, made more liberal or relaxed some of what goes into the types of determinations that can be made in order to continue to provide students with those funds under HEERF II and under HEERF III, and we'll talk about those here in a few minutes. The continuation of how far out you as an institution want to establish your process in order to be able to have it tied to COVID is another major issue that each institution is left to their own devices. Sally, in the broadest sense, you're absolutely right. This is all still, and the department does remind everybody that this is all money that is still related to the pandemic. But they've moved, and Congress has moved farther and farther away from the more specific ties to COVID to more broad-based issues. What I will give the department a great deal of credit for is in the FAQs, they have done a great job, really a great job in providing a lot of the do's and don'ts for not only determination of exceptional need, but also some of these other questions that we'll get into here in just a few minutes. A real brief reminder, because I thought it warranted it, the supplemental agreement that all institutions are required to sign, regardless of type of institution, really is a very brief reminder and of all of the requirements that have preceded the most recent guidance and kind of encapsulates where everything is. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading through all of these, but it does remind you of the broader, now under number 2, expansion of the individual groups of students that are eligible, not only DACA, also those solely enrolled in in distance education and online, as well as non-Title IV students at a Title IV eligible institution, even including non-Title IV eligible programs at a Title IV eligible institution. 3 just acknowledges that you're retaining these funds on behalf of the students and others. 4 acknowledges the fact that you are prioritizing, especially now with the HEERF II and HEERF III funds, you're prioritizing those students that are most in need, that exceptional need discussion that we'll talk about in greater detail. A lot of institutions are basing that on Pell eligibility, but you'll see as this goes forward, not only in part 4, but 5 here, that they are looking at other types of ways in which those funds can be utilized, especially based on the recipient's needs and conditions. So, and also the fact that the recipient's future at the institution is not predicated on their utilization and how they utilize these funds. You're holding the funds in trust for the students, that the recommended way in which to disperse the funds correlates with the maximum federal Pell grants, but each institution should consider case by case, basically
professional judgment.
Professional judgment, and that also, in addition to Pell eligibility type criterion, they should look at the consideration the particular socioeconomic circumstances of the individuals. You will note on number 6, again, the use of the term strongly, the use of professional judgment, and there's a lot of latitude given to all institutions in the development of their own processes and procedures. As Sally and I have talked about on prior webinars, you're probably going to want to go back and look at your HEERF II processes that you developed in light of all of this new guidance, and especially the do's and don'ts. You probably are going to need to tweak your processes given all of the additional new students, as well as the do's and don'ts that they've talked about. So again, a good reason why a lot of institutions may not have put forth their money, put forth any money to students or institutions, depending on what type of institution you are, for good reason. And as we look to go forward, again, developing these processes and procedures, and if you have, let's say for the sake of argument, as a for-profit A4 institution, you have already started to administer some of your institutional funds under one set of procedures. If you're going to review those and if you're going to change them, and you may well need to, if nothing else, to add in the additional eligible students to that process, you need to date and show where you're correspondingly making changes based on the new guidance. Again, the reasons why latitude and time are giving more and more information for all of us to react and respond to. But as the department has said all along, make darn sure it's always document, but also keep the dates in mind, because you're going to need to, in years into the future, show where these incremental changes came about and as a result of you as institutions and all of us as collective communities responding to new guidance and the changes both from Congress and then the corresponding regulations. The 9th and 10th, that the fact that you can voluntarily decline, and the acknowledgement that you are required to submit these reports on a timely manner. Again, both for any type of institution, you don't have to take down your your HEERF II or your HEERF III funds. You have specific guidelines if you didn't take HEERF II but want to take HEERF III, regardless of what type of institution you are. If you didn't take down your HEERF II and you're asking for the HEERF III, and this is an important new wrinkle, if you're a private nonprofit or a public institution and you didn't take HEERF II and you want to take HEERF III, you do have to reapply. Similarly, for institutions that are in the proprietary sector, you would be applying under A1 versus A4, but you actually do have to go through the whole process again, as opposed to if you were participants in 2 and moved on to 3, everybody has an easier glide path to getting the funds dropped into their G5 accounts if you were a participant in both 1 and 2. So now let's get down to the real nitty-gritty. The FAQs that I alluded to that were published on May 11th really go through this with a fine-tooth comb. And again, regardless of what type of institution you are, I think that the department deserves a great deal of credit on building on all of their prior FAQs, all of the prior guidance on nuanced issues like lost revenue, like payroll, and this built on all of that prior guidance. They start out in their questions with basically an overview. This is the first question. I didn't put the numbers that corresponded because we aren't going to go through all 53 questions. We wouldn't have enough time even in the hour and a half, but we will be going through most of them. The department's broadest opening kind of salvo in terms of questions and answers is what's different between HEERF III and HEERF II. Their acknowledgement is the fact that, again, there are differences in terms of the framework, the fact that the policies and procedures for HEERF III will probably supplant, if not supplement, the policies and procedures you had for starting off with HEERF II, regardless of type of institution. It reminds everybody of just the fact that there is the differentiation, continuation of the differentiation between the A1 category of institutions, which is what you see listed here, and the A4 category, which again you see listed here. For the institutions that are A1 and have additional institutional monies coming to them through HEERF II and HEERF III, there are 2 new responsibilities under HEERF III of the potential utilization of and the required utilization of these funds. Institutions receiving the HEERF II and HEERF III institutional funds must now implement evidence-based practices to monitor and suppress coronavirus in accordance with the public health guidelines. Again, this is making sure that these funds at the institutional level are tied back to coronavirus, are tied back to the guidance and the requirements, and those institutions must conduct direct outreach to financial aid applicants explaining the opportunity for access and utilization of the COVID relief funds. For proprietary institutions, again, I've already covered this, but it talks specifically about what an institution needs to do in order to receive its HEERF III funds and the differentiation of that between HEERF II and HEERF III. Again, you see the August 11th deadline right here, and the fact that this is for an institution that received the HEERF II funds. They go on to talk about what if you didn't receive the HEERF III funds. You have to go through the much longer process of once again submitting your SF-424s along with your certification agreement, and then another signed certification as well. Again, all of this is still under the same deadline of August 11th. One of the first, one of the first major areas that the department attempted to define was the expansion of student. Without going through all of the regulatory gobbledygook here, what they included and what this stipulates is the fact that all of the different definitions of students lead to the fact that students basically of all types are eligible. This includes not only those that are enrolled in Title IV, but non-Title IV eligible institutions. There is still the threshold that the institution has to be a Title IV eligible institution to have received the grant assistance. There are a number of institutions that are non-Title IV that are frustrated because they believe that their institution and their students should have been and should still now to this day be eligible for the funds, but Congress made a decision that they had to find some type of defining line, and they chose Title IV eligible institutions. That means that a lot of online entities and institutions that don't participate in Title IV are on the outside looking in, but that's where the process goes. In terms of the determination of eligibility for these students with exceptional need, which is again what they talked about in great detail. We'll talk about this more in just a few minutes. They reminded that it does now include individuals enrolled in distance education. So this was my way of trying to depict to all students, including online students, and then also students that are enrolled in DACA and Dreamers and the other types of institutions, other types of students as well. For those individuals that are receiving this grant assistance, again, going back through this question, it talks about the reasons and the ways in which to establish exceptional need. And under exceptional need, again, they assert and suggest that Pell eligibility should be part of that process, but that it doesn't have to be the only or the main factor. Under professional judgment, institutions can develop processes, and as long as you develop it and you tell what and describe what your policy is, that's what you need to follow, and that's what they will assess whether or not those students are eligible. In the body of these documents, it talks about everything from the fact that students that are studying abroad, as long as they are tied to a Title IV eligible institution, that those individuals would be eligible. Foreign students coming into the institution, even in non-Title IV, as well as Title IV eligible programs, are eligible. So again, a much greater recognition of the type of students that are eligible. And then as it relates to exceptional need, we'll go a little bit further into that detail in just a minute. One of the things that carries over from HEERF II to HEERF III is in this prioritization process, as you see here, where again, the department emphasizes that domestic students over and undergraduate students over others should be priority, and that in the domestic students to include DACA, they do also make it very clear that in terms of making sure that students, once they receive those funds, how they utilize those funds, that it does link to that consent discussion that I talked about before. So that does carry over to HEERF III from HEERF II. And therefore, in essence, once again, what Congress made very clear, and the department, are following up on and making very clear, is that this is the student's money. The money goes to the student. If the student then chooses to have that money come back to the institution, that is when a consent form needs to be acknowledged, or as you're drawing down those monies, if you want to, and again, this is discussions you should have with counsel and with FAME in terms of their processes. If the student acknowledges at the time of receipt of the funds that they want to apply those funds, you need to have the proper consent forms in place, and you need to be able to ensure that there is no collusion or coercion in the opportunity for cost of attendance, related tuition, and other fees to have been a portion or all of how the student's funds are utilized. Moreover,
Tom,
yes,
I
ma'am.
just want to remind everybody that when you're looking at exceptional need, it's not who owes you the money. It's the student's true need. Schools have sometimes a tendency to look at accounts receivable and think if the student owes them a lot of money, that's exceptional need, and be very careful of what you're using there. In addition, when you're posting funds after the student's given you written permission, there's a couple of things to keep in mind on the ledger cards. Number one, that these do get reported on 1098-T, your HEERF funds, and they do not get reported for your 9010. So be sure that you're documenting your ledgers correctly, so that when you're doing your calculation of your 9010, they're not picked up incorrectly as Title IV aid or as cash, either one. They don't go either way.
And Sally's timing is impeccable. She knew that because this slide was coming up. But you can see right here, the department is forewarning that this is going to be an area of sensitivity moving forward. They state right here, and that's the reason why we highlighted it, that the department will be providing additional and exploring additional reporting requirements regarding the distribution of aid as it relates to individuals. These 5 individuals you see here are actually case studies of DACA students that I made sure to highlight, because these are individuals that were part of the reason and part of a report that made it so that, again, Congress and the department move forward with including DACA and Dreamers and others in that process. Sally brings up, and I cannot overemphasize enough, the fact that once again, you need to be very, very prudent with the way in which you address the giving of any funds and that come back to your institution. A lot of institutions make the statement, well, Tom, when we give them the money and it goes out the door, we no longer control that. You're right, you don't, but you do control the consent form, and you do control making sure that protecting your institution includes as much documentation as possible so that it is unimpeachable. Listen to my words, unimpeachable evidence that this was their decision and their choice. It's going to be heavily scrutinized. Please don't find yourself on the wrong side of that decision.
That
Again,
means that every single student should not be signing an authorization.
That is correct. That's what it also means. It also means that, again, there are certain things that should not be a part of that prioritization of exceptional need. The department did provide 4 specific examples. It shouldn't be based, again, and as you read through these, it shouldn't be based on their GPA, or it shouldn't be based on their current status or performing or standing. Again, things that relate to more academic issues and things that are institution-centric, not student-centric. The required continued enrollment at the institution, or that they pay this before they are able to continue to move forward or seek any further access to information or the like at the institution. Again, the department is sending very strong signals here. They're clear and unambiguous that these are the students' funds, and if you're being institutional-centric in your policies, that is not going to serve you well at the point at which evaluation and review of the utilization of these funds happen. And as we've discussed already on multiple occasions, I can assure you there are already OIG discussions and actual audits that are taking place, not to impugn anybody, but to see how all sectors of institutions of higher education are administering and delivering the HEERF I funds. This will continue to inform how the process moves forward, and you can rest assured that some of that led into some of these do's and don'ts.
Tom, I would like to add one to that, and that's attendance. Because we have a lot of institutions that think attendance is part of SAT progress and everything else, and you need to be very careful that attendance is another one of those that if somebody's got poor attendance, you can't say you're not eligible for these funds.
Thank you, Sally. What I alluded to earlier, here's a question that spoke specifically to what if the check that was issued to a student is not cashed or somehow initiated. It does say that you have the ability to do so. What it makes clear is that you can't utilize the student portion of the funds in order to undertake this process, but you can use the institutional side of the funds in order to do so. What are the unallowable uses of the HEERF grant funds? Again, to the department's credit, they started to make it very clear some of the things, not only the first bullet here, which is in the statute, and subsequently the first 3 of these are really in the statute as written, but then the 4th bullet on down are really expounding upon portions of the statute of things that the funds cannot be used for. All of this was written into the statute, so they're just again reemphasizing the fact that the funds can't be utilized for those type of issues. When it comes to payroll, again, the department has put forth some additional guidance here on what can and cannot be those funds can be utilized for. They can use it for payroll, including employee benefits. And again, that's one of the things that people were asking for additional guidance. If such costs were newly associated with coronavirus, again, back to the fact it has to be tied to coronavirus, and they were incurred after the start of the emergency, consistent with the principles, you must pay students for internships and job training experience. This was a new addition that was added, but it was discussed in prior webinars and prior guidance. They give examples of how the funds can or cannot be utilized. So again, go back and review these at your leisure, but they're important. One of the other questions, and again, this relates back to what we were just talking about in the soapbox that I just got on. You may have seen in the recent press that the department gave major kudos to a public institution for using the grants to basically discharge student debt. That is something that can be done, and as you see highlighted, the department strongly even encourages institutions to discharge student debt. But again, it's under the requirements of consent and the requirements that you do this through processes that are heavily documented and that you can show that you are doing it in the ways in which the department finds favor with. The department, because they know this is going to be such a sensitive issue, goes on to provide 3 examples of the ways in which the institution should handle specific situations. These are more private, nonprofit, and public institution centric, but not entirely. You could withhold transcripts or potentially withhold enrollment or the other things. These are scenarios that the department specifically talks about. You will note that they talk about the fact that you must get the written consent, which is what we have talked about ad nauseum. It then goes on to talk about how the institution can go about doing that, and conversely, what the institution cannot do. So these slides and the subsequent slides on outstanding balances that count and counted as lost revenue, which is another one of the questions that many institutions have put forward. This is language that we encourage you to continue to review, and again, seek counsel not only with FAME, but with your counsel and also with your auditors, as they are going to be responsible and already are responsible for the review of this through your audits. And while we want you to be able to utilize this to the full extent of regulatory compliance, we also want to continually and continuously remind you that this is one of those areas that you do need to proceed with caution and with a great deal of thought before you move forward. Sally, can I overemphasize this one enough?
I don't think there's any way to overemphasize, Tom. I absolutely agree with you.
Again, they talk about what is permissible marketing and recruiting. The bottom line here is probably, again, almost like caveat emptor, buyer beware. In this instance, it's institution beware. Issues that relate to marketing and recruiting, you should steer clear of. They talk about some of the examples of how institutional funds may be used that are favorable, and that is under retention and re-engagement. This is for HEERF II and HEERF II and HEERF III funds. So this relates, and these are important for our private nonprofit and public institutions within FAME. This is not for our private for-profits, because again, there are no institutional funds, but they are prescriptive in how the funds can be utilized under the institutional side. Again, equally as fervent as I am with how you use the funds, be careful on this one. There is sensitivity to, obviously, any utilization of these funds for marketing, recruiting, or advertising, or anything that is deemed admissions institutional oriented, even as you're required to ensure that the students, and they kind of talk at cross purposes here, and the department and others recognize that. You'll recall one of the 2 new additions is that you are supposed to let individuals know that these monies are here if you have COVID-related issues in order to have access to the funds. So on the one hand, you do have to openly acknowledge and, for lack of a better term, market the fact that students have access to these funds. But the dynamic is, don't make it so that you're saying, hey, we've got X number of dollars for you through the HEERF II and HEERF III grants in order for you to enroll in our institution. That would be deemed inappropriate. Obviously, the kind of things that would be deemed appropriate are more to the effect of the federal government has put forth these opportunities for these funds. Here's where you can find out information about them. And again, for all types of institutions, consult with your attorneys on these counsel on these type of issues. There are quarterly reporting requirements for the HEERF III grants, the same way in HEERF II grants. They, for the A1 institutions and the A4 institutions, these are the same. They are the same as they were under HEERF I. So it's the, kind of a process, another reporting process we're getting used to. And you will be doing it on a quarterly basis, 10 days after the end of the quarter. Again, it does adhere to the HEERF I requirements that this must be posted conspicuously on your website. As we have learned from the HEERF I to HEERF II process and HEERF II to HEERF III process, it is in your best interest to also simply send back to HEERF and to your GAN individual the posting of this information. It will hold you in good stead in the application process, and it also will help you and preparing for and showing to them that you're preparing for both, as you already have supported, your 2020 annual report and your upcoming 2021 and 22 and 23 annual reports. Again, all of this is information that is basically what you already know, but they reaffirm that a lot of this is there. The annual report, one of the other things that they do talk about is that there will be additional guidance that they contemplate for the HEERF III, and that more guidance will be coming out regarding these as they continue to move forward. But that right now, the HEERF I and HEERF II processes are what you're going to continue to abide by. All institutions are subject to audit requirements still. There are differentiation of those between type of institution. So again, as you look to what type of responsibilities you have, if you're a private for-profit, you have the guidance under the proprietary audit guide. If you're a private nonprofit or a public institution, you will go through the single audit requirements, and all of that information has been provided to each type of community. Again, expenditure of the funds, you have a year from the portion of time when you receive your allocations. That could be different for your institution versus your student allocations, both in HEERF I for all institutions and in HEERF II and III for public and private nonprofit institutions. And it gives examples of how that process unfolds. This is another key area of distinction, and it regards drawing down the funds once they've been obligated by the department. It talks about the fact that, and one of the things that was a lesson learned by many types of institutions was that you aren't supposed to draw all of these funds down at the point at which you receive them. They should remain in your GAN's account and only be drawn down at the point at which you are expending the funds. That keeps you out of harm's way with things like but the potential accrual of interest that results in having to repay money back to the federal government, and other issues around 2 CFR 200 that are part of what we've learned as the process unfolds. Again, you should proceed with caution here. This is another one of the areas that I can tell you even in the OIG audits that are being done, again, as a cursory kind of first step in seeing how institutions across all sectors are utilizing these monies. The department and the Office of the Inspector General is paying a lot of attention to the drawdown and to following the guidance under 2 CFR 200. That includes continuing to seek guidance from the department on the guidance that was received that said that you can only draw down for HEERF II and HEERF III portions based on what quarter or what portion of the awarding period you're in. The department does appear to be wanting to walk back on some of that guidance because they recognize it's inconsistent with the overall processes and determinations that are being done with the HEERF program and with the administration of the HEERF program funds. But again, you need to be very careful and cautious as you go through this process. Can my institution discharge expenses to my ARP award if the expenses were incurred before March 11th of 2021, the day of enactment of ARP? The good news is that that's yes. Again, as discussed, it can go backwards and forwards. But again, even with retroactivity, the important part here is you need to be able to show that when your expenditures are being done, have the documentation to show the expenditures. And obviously, I think it should be relatively common sense, but even as we weave back through the beneficial changes in interpretation and utilization of funds, you want to expend your HEERF I monies first, your HEERF II monies second, and your HEERF III monies third, so that you can comply with the annual reporting requirements as this process goes through. Indirect cost, another one of the things that is a big question for all types of institutions. This was something that has been discussed for HEERF I for the proprietary sector, and for HEERF II and III predominantly, and if not exclusively, for private nonprofits and the publics. Yes is the short answer, but there are, again, very, very specific guidance and requirements on indirect costs. This data gives you some of that breakdown, and they do encourage you to go to a specific indirect cost website for more information on this. Again, this is something that for the private nonprofits and publics that are part of FAME, you want to talk at great detail with your auditors because these types of issues are auditor driven and are in need of a good dialogue with your auditors. Similarly, direct administrative cost, another area that on the institutional portion of the awards, and this is also under the any student, but does not include the student portion. Direct administrative costs are permissible, but there are specific guidelines that go along with them. The good news, one of the areas of good news, there was a great deal of questioning of the uniform guidance under 2 CFR 200 regarding a lot of the requirements on how institutions are to look at their cost structures and everything from going out and seeking RFPs for the purchases of major portions of the faculty, the instructional materials or other requirements. The department goes into great detail of what is not permissible and also what is permissible. But the good news and the good takeaway here is that for a lot of our institutions, the uniform guidance and those requirements is not applicable. Trying to apply a lot of this at a time when, once again, these were emergency assistance and the ability to purchase system software or infrastructure or other things to convert to online and to continue to provide online education and the like, to go through the RFP processes and the like would have been time prohibitive and counterintuitive to what the process brings forward. Continue to review these, but it's good information overall. The MO, which is the Memorandum of Understanding, does that apply to the HEERF? Once again, this is very much in the weeds, but the good news is the answer to that is also no. This is good news for, again, the maintenance of effort requirements were another area where a lot of our institutions were wondering how they were going to comply. And the good news is that by and large, we don't have to. There was, again, some institutions that received notices directly about their cash drawdowns that received alerts that were of concern, basically because it said that you were out of compliance with the regulatory process. The department clarifies how that unfolds and moves forward. It talks specifically about what to do when an institution merges or closes. Again, the first step basically with anything with HEERF that I can tell you is more and more the guidance is saying go directly to your specific GAN individual as listed on box 3. That is repeated throughout many, many portions of this. So that should be your first line of discussion. This one was another one that was interesting. We're placed on, and it's a continuation of the prior, and it's the ability just to show how the process should unfold as you move forward. Big question, what enforcement actions could the department take against an institution that is misusing the HEERF grants 1, 2, or 3? You can see here, but I don't think it should come as any surprise to you that it's the same type of tools and resources that the department would have for other forms of administrative or financial responsibility or capabilities that were not followed through on directly. Again, heightened cash monitoring being at the top of their list, placing the HEERF grants on the route payment status, essentially kind of a freeze, very much like HCM1 and HCM2, placing the institution on at-risk status, a flag that would once again impact not only the drawdowns and the utilization, but further reporting and scrutiny of the institution, LS&T actions, or as part of that process as well. Again, here you go with regards to closeout, coming all the way back to where we started earlier today. If we've expended all of our funds, what is the process that we should go through? This literally is the same 6 steps that we provided for you earlier today. With that, and with about 20 minutes left for questions and answers, a lot of information to go through in a relatively short period of time, but I hope that that gives you a kind of a broad overview of where things stand. The thing that I can assure you is that myself and Sally and others continue to have very regular and routine conversations with individuals over in the Department of Education. The department does continue to recognize that there are schools that are individually in need of help, both in order to address issues of where those GANs individuals in box 3 may not be as responsive as you need them to be. Share that with us so that we can share that up the chain of command. Obviously, that is not intended to be utilized to speak ill or negatively, but just simply continue to be able to marshal you on towards the opportunity to have access to the funds for your students. As you're going through that process as well, I think one of the things to always keep in mind, and that has served me well in the discussions with individuals up here, is if there are delays in the application process or the ability to draw down the funds, the individuals that are being harmed there are the students. It's certainly not you as an institution, because you have, especially with HEERF II and HEERF III, if you're an A4 proprietary institution designee, we know that there is no additional administrative funds or any WIFM from a fiscal perspective for you in that process. But we are very much, as we always are, helpful to the students and want to do the best to protect those students and continue to give them access to needed resources so that they can be retained as our students, so they can complete their education and they can enter the workforce in the programs that you provide. Similarly, that runs across all types of institutions. And if you do have specific questions that are from the private nonprofit or public sector, we can answer those for you as well, either here or Sally and I can either email or hop on a call with you to talk about some of the idiosyncrasies or the unique sides of that side of the HEERF II and HEERF III programs as well. With that, Sally, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Tom. You did a great job. A lot of information in a short period of time. So we do have some questions. I think the first one you've already answered. I only received HEERF I funds and it was closed out. I did the quarterly budget and expenditures reporting. Do I have to do anything else? I spoke to someone. She said I did everything I have to do. I don't have to do anything else.
I would get that in writing. I would make sure that you at least followed all of the 6 steps. It sounds like you did. But the one thing that I would encourage you to do is follow back up with that GANs individual and get something in writing. Where we have seen a couple of hiccups in the HEERF II application process is where correspondence coming from the department back to the institution didn't happen or didn't happen timely. And that should not result in problems for you as an institution where those type of things have happened, because again, this is a new process for the department as well. The department does acknowledge and does work to make and fix those type of circumstances, but just as a safeguard. And then as you maintain those documentations for 3 years, seeking an official notification from the department, which you should receive. So you're not asking for something that is not part of their process, should be the culmination of the closeout of your process.
Good advice, Tom. The next one is, can you excuse me, can you roll over unused HEERF I funds to HEERF II? And would you still need to request an extension?
No, you cannot roll them over. Yes, you can ask for an extension. The extension is the way you work towards expending all of those funds. You cannot commingle, even though they're dropping them into the same G5 account, they are in the same account, but they are separately designated. So you do, and again, this is why in the tracking of them, again, you want to allocate the money and drawdowns for your HEERF 1, then your HEERF 2, then your HEERF 3.
Okay, thanks, Tom. The next one again is in regard to closing out HEERF 1. They expended all their funds by August 20th. Where do we find out the closeout procedures? We've already listed them twice, so you've got the information in this handout. What do you do with HEERF 1 funds that were issued by check but never cashed? This is always a possibility.
Again, that is the quintessential concern right now. What you have the ability to do is the department has made notice in prior guidance that you must make attempts to reach out to the student that you originally presented the check to and try to determine and try and allow them adequate time to cash the check. Again, 2 to 3 forms of outreach over a 2 to 3 week window is kind of a rule of thumb that is out there. Once that has occurred, and again, you can show that you've done your due diligence within that 14-day period, then what you have the capability and the right to do for HEERF 1 funds is to void out those checks and to stop payment. You have the authority, if you want to use portions of your institutional monies to pay for that, the voiding of those checks and that process, because it does cost money for the banks to do that, unless you can convince the banks not to. I've heard some institutions, because it's COVID money, that said that they waive those fees. But regardless, you then bring that money back in, or basically that money is still on the books, and you need to reallocate that money under a process that you develop. Again, it can go to the prior students, or it can go to new students, however your processes are developed. The major concern here is that what you don't want is unexpended student monies on your HEERF 1 books and fully expended institutional monies on your HEERF 1 books, because then you will be out of compliance with the agreement and certification and all of the requirements that you signed off on in bringing the HEERF money forward. And that's for all types of institutions.
I think if you establish your policies and procedures, which you should have done already, and how you're issuing this money, how you're tracking it, at what point you contact the student again for a follow-up, when do you void the check, all of that needs to be in writing, and you need to follow your policies and procedures, because that's going to protect you in the future for what you've done. Next question is, where do I find the certification form? I'm assuming for HEERF 3. I don't know. They didn't say.
The websites are pretty clear. If you go even to just to ad.gov and you type in HEERF 1 versus HEERF 2 versus HEERF 3, you'll see the drop down, and it's pretty clear that you can go to the primary landing page. Depending on what type of institution you are, if you are a private for-profit, then you go to the subsequent page that's listed a little bit further down. For proprietary schools, if you're a private nonprofit or a public institution, stay on that landing page, and literally the first things you'll see are the application form and the application process on each of the landing pages.
So the next one was, how are institutions using HEERF 3 funds toward a student's tuition if they request and give written information? I'm not sure what you're asking. Basically, if the student tells you they want to use that money toward their tuition and they've given you written permission, you just post it as a payment toward tuition. Again, be careful that you've earmarked it, that it does go toward 1090-AT and it does not go toward 9010. So whatever system you're using, you want to be sure that you've got that clearly identified.
And candidly, that's one of the ways that might help to show because you better have a consent form for every one of those. B, keeping that separate for purposes of hopefully, and again, the department has made clear, and I should have said this, and I'll go back because it is important, all the way up to your supplemental agreement. Supplemental agreement number 8, you will note here the last sentence on bullet number 8. The Secretary has determined consider these individual emergency grants do not constitute federal education assistance under Title IV of the HEA. This is May 11th guidance, meaning the current administration. But that statement right there shows you that if you keep these set aside, even if they come back into your institution, they do not count for purposes of 9010 as financial federal education assistance funds.
Okay, so the next is, where do we get the paperwork to decline the funds?
It is on the primary website, but you can also get it on the FAQ pages as well. It's available on any one of a number of different portions of the department's most recent places. It's built into the FAQs and elsewhere. Sally, if you want, we can, and it's probably a good thing for us to consider doing for all of the FAME folks, is we will be obviously reminding you between now and August 11th of your responsibilities and obligations, but we'll give you direct access to those various links in the near future.
That's a great idea. So the next one's related to the last one. Since we decided not to draw down HEERF II, are we required to decline the funds? If so, how do I do that, etc.? And
yes.
We're back to, if you filled out the application and you got an authorization for it, then obviously you do have to decline. If you decided not to even apply for it, then obviously you wouldn't have to decline anything.
Again, I'll read to you the top of the voluntary form. This form may be completed by any institution that would like to decline all or portion of their American Rescue Act, HEERF III, program funds awarded under the grant program. Institutions that have not received HEERF funds should not complete this form, and the completed form must be emailed to the HEERF refund@ed.gov site by August 11th. So again, it's for any institution that had HEERF I or HEERF II that this form needs to go forward if you don't want all or a portion of your HEERF III. And the department has yet again done a good job of saying, okay, if you want to only keep a portion of your funds, depending on what type of institution you are, you can check the box and either put all and fill in the whole amount, or a portion of it, and also and provide the PRAV award number. So they're pretty prescriptive and pretty prescriptive. But the primary reason for this is that they do recognize that more and more institutions are looking at, even with the broader definitions, whether or not they really can tie these funds to something that is COVID related, and or candidly, even at other types of institutions, there is a big question, even at institutions that are getting funds to help them cover the cost of administering these funds, as to whether or not it's worth it, and whether or not the students have already received enough money in order to no longer necessarily warrant large portions of the funds. Let me give you an example just to try and show what I mean by that. Let's take a traditional four-year college or university, in this particular instance, that has fall and spring semesters. A lot of those individuals that are at that institution, other than new enrollees, likely had HEERF I and potentially HEERF II funds, depending on their processes and the need to continue to provide funds as they saw fit, the same way you saw fit. Well, as we have more individuals enrolling that are aware, unless there are extenuating circumstances, back to that exceptional need, students are aware of these and likely are providing for their future under the new FAFSA, under their FAFSA, which will capture some of the unfortunate circumstances that may have incurred, like a loss of a job or other things. But a lot of the money is then therefore only for a catch up if something happens while the student is enrolled. And they don't want to double and triple down on those students that have already received monies, again, to help them through the pandemic, as opposed to just simply subsidizing their overall educational costs throughout the length of their time at that associate's degree or baccalaureate degree or other institutional program. There are a lot of institutions that are turning this money away.
Yeah, there are. The next one is, do we have to opt out of HEERF II funds as well by filling out the same form?
Very good question. There are no indications that you opt out of HEERF II, and the reality is you've either opted in or not opted out because the application deadline was April 15th.
Okay.
So again, that's my way of saying you basically have missed the deadline. If you didn't apply, you're not going to get those funds. If you did apply and you were in process and there were glitches, then you could still be eligible. But if you didn't apply, that it's already sunsetted. So you don't have to reaffirm the fact that you didn't complete the process. The department already knows that and is working to reallocate those funds.
I think in this case, they probably applied and now decided they don't want to use the funds, and they're trying.
That's a different question. That question is, and if that is the case, you have the right to just simply return the funds. Even though you have them all, you don't have to draw down any of them. And you can simply determine to return them now and basically do that same closeout process and those same steps, starting with contacting your GAN official from box 3 and moving forward with the process in that way.
And we have one more. How do I get the certification form for the owners to sign for the HEERF III?
It is, again, it's on the HEERF website for the proprietary schools. We also have access to it. We will be putting that forward for everybody. Please make sure that, again, your president, CEO, signs the first section, and any individuals with 25% more of ownership sign the section 2.
Okay, I'm scrolling through. I don't think, wait a minute. Is what Sally said regarding ledger just pertaining to HEERF III? It's anything you post to the ledger, whether it was HEERF II, HEERF III, once you had the ability to use that money, it all works the same. Here's another one. Are students who have defaulted student loans eligible for HEERF II or HEERF III?
Yes, they are, unless you make it as part of your processes, then they are not. And you need to be careful because you run into questions of potential discrimination.
And then if our school did not apply for HEERF I, II, or III, do we still need to complete and submit the voluntary decline of HEERF funds form? No, because you never applied, so you didn't get any authorization to have them or anything.
It would still be in your best interest for HEERF III because this one does say that there is a process, Sally. I think it's still in the best interest of that institution to affirm that through the submission of the voluntarily declining form that they're not eligible, that they choose not to do the HEERF III funds. There is a cause that you're checking one box or the other with the HEERF III funds for the first time.
Okay.
Would you agree with that? I mean, it does specifically say that all institutions
decline if you've never applied, but I guess it's okay.
Yeah, but it does say, again, if you're an institution that is Title IV, you've had funds allocated to you, and they want your declaration one way or the other for the HEERF III funds.
Okay. I think that is it as I go through everything again, and we're almost at time. Wait a minute. With HEERF III, what is the time of enrollment for eligible students?
In the broadest sense, I think in the broadest sense, this still relates back to any student enrolled at the time of the announcement of the pandemic on March 13th forward. You have to have your policies and procedures that, once again, build off of HEERF I, but realistically, your HEERF II policies and procedures, informed by all of this May 11th guidance, is what you're likely to have, with potential modifications with additional guidance from the department, to be your processes for the HEERF III funds once you as an institution have received those and start to then administer them.
So this is an interesting one. Our college prioritized, anyway, made important HEERF III funds by Pell EFC, and is in the process of reviewing requests of funds for non-Pell recipients. Some students use their tuition ledger showing a balance owed to the college as their documentation to receive funds, while others provided counseling records, daycare needs. Would the tuition ledger satisfy documentation of need? I don't believe so. The fact that they have money, I don't think is need.
No, but again, Sally, and I want to be careful with this one, that warrants further review and probably a question to the department, because again, the department did say, and the department did give kudos to institutions that relieve student debt with the use of the funds. Where we run into a problem here is, again, you have to make sure you have the proper consents in the portion of that process, and you also have to make sure that it is not only with with the consent there, but that it is again, after the student is at will to make the decision. Here, I'm trying to find the exact language here.
I understand, but I think you're back to, I think the fact that they have a ledger balance doesn't mean they have the need. I guess because they're Pell eligible, but I think that's a little iffy. But I guess we'll.
And again, that's why here's the line of questioning that I think starts to address that. Can an institution use the American Rescue Plan, HEERF III, or other HEERF institutional grant assistance funds to discharge student debt? It's the institutional side, not the student side. And the department encouraged that on the institutional side. On the student side, again, it relates back to the consent. And again, I agree with you that you got to be very, very cautious and very, very careful.
And I think we have one more here. We're a proprietary institution, and for the HEERF II, all funds go to the student. And so HEERF III, do all the institutional, will the institutional get any institutional funds like HEERF I? And the answer is no. You're back.
The answer, unfortunately, is no.
Oh, one more. For HEERF I, we were able to withdraw the fund to our bank account. For HEERF II and III, we should go through FAME to request the funds to go to students. Is this correct? No, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to draw the funds into your bank account, and then you're going to apply those funds to the student's account. It's not like Pell or direct loans. It's something that once you have the authorization from the student, you're going to do the posting. FAME is not going to be involved in that. So you're going to draw the funds just like you normally do down. They're going into your special account. From that account, you're then going to, once you have the authorization from the student, you can post those funds to the ledger card. We had a student who did not cash his check, a drop student from October. He contacted the institution to have the check reissued. He was eligible at the time it was issued, but not active now and dropped due to COVID. Can a replacement check be released to him without concern? Absolutely.
Yes.
Oh, I'm asked to repeat what we said about the 1098 and 9010. A reminder, any of this money that goes to students is not part of 9010. So if that student wants to have with an authorization that money applied to their account, that money still does not count in the 90-10 calculation, either side of it. But it is going to go on a 1098T because it's a special grant. And then I see, did we hear that every student should not be receiving funds? Depends on what your policy is. You have to have a written policy and how you determine it, who gets the money. And if you have students that were not affected by anything from COVID, and there are students that are going to be in that situation. No family members got sick, they didn't lose jobs, they had access to child care, nothing is any different. You're going to have a hard time justifying those students might need the money, especially if they weren't Pell eligible. So you have to write your policy, and whatever your policy is, follow it.
And again, not to put the fear of God in you, but to put the fear of God in you. There are already instances that we're aware of, or at least that I'm aware of, where OIG individuals have gone knocking on students' doors to ask them specifically if they receive funds and learn how they receive funds. There is a great deal of speculation that, again, students need to be forthcoming in this process as well, and that, again, they might learn how to fund the system. They also want to make sure that the institution is not funding the system, i.e. the consent forms and the way in which this process unfolds. So don't think for a second that this isn't going to be heavily scrutinized, and your processes and following them will matter.
And Tom, I think we're at time, but thank you so much. It was a great session. I think we covered a lot of information, and I'm sure we'll be getting some more questions through email, and I'll be forwarding them to you.
And happy to be a part of the team, Sally. And again, my biggest takeaways for everybody right now is, if you haven't expended all your HEERF I, get your request in, get your extension. It is, with valid reasons, it will be done. It will be approved, and that gives you the additional time to make the accommodations that are needed for HEERF I. Continue to review your HEERF II/HEERF III policies and procedures in light of this new guidance, and be very, very careful with the administration of any money that went to the student that is going to be coming back into your institution.
I agree. And meanwhile, Tom, you're going to work on something for the website so that you have all of these links, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. Everybody have a good day. Thank you. And we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks when we do another webinar.
Bye now.
Bye.